Arthur Pendleton stood motionless, letting his son's words hit him like stones. His children had found him, not in a home, but in a junkyard. And the sight of his new life in a dilapidated RV had unleashed years of pain and anger. They saw another failure, another broken dream waiting to happen, and they simply could not bear it.
I can't.
But just as Arthur's spirit was about to break, the stray dog he had rescued did something no one expected. It was not a bark or a growl. It was a silent, deliberate act of defiance that would change everything. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The brakes on the old Ford F-150 groaned in protest, a sound of metal surrendering to rust and time. The truck rolled to a stop just inside the gate, its engine sputtering into a silence that was immediately filled by the soft, persistent drumming of an Oregon drizzle on the roof. Before him, under a sky the color of wet slate, lay Gus's auto salvage and scrap. It was less a yard and more a range of metallic mountains, jagged peaks of crushed cars and tangled rebar that rose toward the gray clouds. The air smelled of rain, damp earth, and the cold, sharp tang of decay. Behind the wheel sat Arthur Pendleton. At 48 years old, he looked a decade older, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and quiet disappointments. He was a tall man, with a frame that had once been filled out by military discipline and hard work, but was now whittled down, leaving his clothes to hang loosely. His brown hair was cut short, practical, but streaked with a heavy silver at the temples. The lines around his kind blue eyes were etched deep, not from laughter, but from years of squinting into the sun on a foreign continent, and, more recently, into the bleakness of his own future. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the colors muted by 100 washings, and jeans that were worn soft and thin at the knees. Everything he owned was in this truck. For a long moment, he just sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, the cracked leather cool beneath his palms. His carpentry business, the dream he had poured his life savings and his soul into after leaving the service, was gone. The workshop was padlocked, the tools sold, the sawdust swept away. The failure had cost him more than just his money. It had cost him his home, and then his marriage. Now, the last of his severance pay had evaporated into gas station coffee and sleepless nights spent in this truck cab. He had reached the end of the road. A figure emerged from a small corrugated tin office near the gate. The man was older than Arthur, likely in his early 70s, with a thick mane of white hair and a face as weathered as the landscape around him. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of someone whose body had seen its share of hard labor, a slight limp favoring his right leg. This was Gus. He wore grease-stained overalls and carried a heavy wrench in one hand, as if it were an extension of his arm. His eyes, however, were sharp and missed nothing. Gus walked up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass with a knuckle. Arthur lowered it, letting in the damp air. "This ain't a parking lot," Gus said, his voice a low gravel. "You're buying or you're selling?" "Neither," Arthur replied, his own voice quiet, rough from disuse. "I was just looking for you." Gus squinted, his gaze sweeping over Arthur, taking in the weary set of his shoulders, the hollows under his eyes, the faint tremor in his hands. He saw the old military duffel bag on the passenger seat and the honorable discharge papers tucked into the sun visor. He saw something else, too. It was a look he recognized, a specific kind of exhaustion he had seen in the eyes of young men in the year 1971, a look that said they had survived one war only to find themselves fighting another one back home. "All right," Gus said, his tone softening just a fraction. "Park it over there. Come with me." Arthur did as he was told, following Gus through the labyrinthine paths of the junkyard. They walked past stacks of tires that rose like ancient columns and rows of cars with shattered windshields that looked like vacant, staring eyes. Gus didn't speak, and Arthur was grateful for the silence. Finally, Gus stopped at the far corner of the yard, a section that seemed to have been forgotten by time. There, half swallowed by overgrown blackberry bushes, sat an old Winnebago motorhome. Its tires were flat, Its white paint was peeling to reveal the aluminum skin beneath, and a fine green carpet of moss was beginning to claim its roof. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a beached whale, sad and immense. "She's a relic," Gus said, slapping a hand against its side. The sound was a dull thud. "Engine's probably seized solid. Plumbing's shot. But the frame is good. The roof don't leak." Much. Arthur just stared at it. It was the ugliest, most hopeless thing he had ever seen. "I've got a proposition for you," Gus continued, turning to face him. "I need someone to help sort copper and aluminum a few hours a day, and I need a night watchman, someone to live on site, keep an eye on things. The local kids get brave sometimes." Arthur's gaze flickered from the RV to Gus, a question forming in his tired eyes. "The rig is yours for $1, Gus said plainly. "You work for your spot here. You earn your keep. This ain't charity. Understand? It's a job." Arthur felt a pressure in his chest ease, a weight he didn't even know was there begin to lift. It wasn't a handout. It was a deal. An arrangement. It was a chance to work, to have a purpose, no matter how small. It was a roof. He looked at the derelict RV again, and for the first time, he didn't see a piece of junk. He saw a sanctuary. "I understand," Arthur said, and the words felt solid, real. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet. Inside, there was a picture of his children from a happier time and a single, folded dollar bill he had kept for luck. He unfolded it and handed it to the old man. Gus took it, the transaction as formal as any business deal. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Arthur used a key from Gus to open the door to his new home. A wave of musty, stale air washed over him. Inside, dust lay thick on every surface, and the faded floral curtains were stiff with age. He sat down on one of the cracked vinyl benches at the dinette table. The cold of the Oregon night was already beginning to seep through the thin walls. He was a man living in a metal box in a graveyard of machines, surrounded by the wreckage of other people's lives. It was the lowest point he had ever reached. But as he sat there in the deepening dark, a profound sense of stillness settled over him. He was not in his truck anymore, waiting for a knock on the window from a police officer. He was not adrift. He had a key. He had a job. He had a place. It wasn't much, but it was a place to start. The first few days in the Winnebago were a blur of monotonous labor and profound silence. By day, Arthur sorted mountains of metal under Gus's watchful eye, his hands growing calloused, his muscles aching with a familiar, honest fatigue. He separated twisted copper pipes from dull gray aluminum siding, the rhythmic work quieting the relentless noise in his head. By night, he would retreat to the cold, dark shell of the RV, the silence returning, deeper and more hollow than before. He had a roof, a job, and 3 sparse meals a day. He should have felt grateful, but what he felt was a loneliness so vast it seemed to have physical weight. On the 4th night, the Oregon sky opened up. Rain fell not in a drizzle, but in a relentless, driving torrent, drumming against the aluminum roof of the RV like 1,000 frantic fingers. The wind howled through the canyons of scrap metal, creating eerie, mournful whistles. Inside, Arthur was wrapped in a thin wool blanket, the only one he had, but the damp cold seemed to pass right through it, settling deep in his bones. He lay on the lumpy cushion of the dinette bench, listening to the storm, feeling as trapped and forgotten as the derelict vehicle around him. It was then that he heard it. A sound, separate from the rain and wind, a faint, rhythmic scratching against the chassis beneath him, followed by a high, thin whimper. It was a sound of such complete and utter misery that it cut through his own bleak thoughts. He sat up, listening intently. It came again, weaker this time, almost swallowed by a gust of wind. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Whatever was out there was not his problem. He had enough of his own. But the sound came a 3rd time, and it was a sound he couldn't unhear. With a heavy sigh, he swung his legs off the bench, his worn boots hitting the gritty floor. He grabbed the heavy flashlight Gus had given him and pulled on his jacket. He pushed the creaking door open and stepped out into the storm. The rain was cold, plastering his hair to his scalp in seconds. Mud sucked at the soles of his boots. He crouched down, shielding the flashlight from the rain, and aimed its bright, steady beam into the darkness under the RV. At first, all he saw were two pinpricks of light, reflecting back at him. Then, as his eyes adjusted, the beam revealed the creature attached to them. It was a dog, huddled against the axle for shelter. A German shepherd, though it was a poor example of the noble breed. Its coat, a mix of silver gray and white, was matted with mud and filth. Its body was painfully thin. He could clearly see the outline of its ribs even through the wet fur. It was shivering violently, a tremor that was part fear and part cold. Its intelligent amber eyes were wide with terror, and its tail was tucked so tightly beneath its body it was almost invisible. The dog didn't growl or bark. It just pressed itself flatter against the ground, trying to disappear. Arthur felt a sharp, painful pang in his chest. It was a feeling of recognition. He saw in the animal's trembling form a reflection of his own brokenness. Here was another soul, just as lost and alone and beaten down by the world as he was. Slowly, carefully, he stood up and went back inside, leaving the door open a few inches. He looked at his own meager dinner, a can of beans, half of which he had saved for breakfast. Without a second thought, he spooned the remaining beans onto a tin plate. He went back outside and crouched down again, keeping a safe distance. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and calm, trying not to spook the animal further. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." He pushed the plate gently into the space under the RV, just within the dog's reach, and then he backed away, sitting on the wet metal steps. The dog stared at the plate, its nose twitching. A battle was raging in its eyes, a war between crippling fear and ravenous hunger. For a full minute, it didn't move. Then, hunger won. With a speed that startled Arthur, it darted forward, its head low, and began to devour the beans, gulping them down without chewing. It never took its eyes off Arthur. As soon as the plate was clean, it scrambled back into the deepest shadows under the chassis. Arthur didn't try to get closer. He just sat there in the rain, a silent communion passing between them. When the cold became too much to bear, he stood up and went back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar, an unspoken invitation in the heart of the storm. He awoke the next morning to the pale, watery light of dawn. The rain had stopped. The first thing he did was look toward the door. Curled up on the muddy ground just outside the bottom step was the German shepherd. It was still wary, lifting its head and watching his every move, but it hadn't run. It had stayed. The knowledge landed in Arthur's gut with a surprising weight. This was no longer just a stray passing through. This was a choice. Arthur had a choice. He prepared his own small breakfast, a piece of dry bread, and broke it in half. He went to the steps and sat down, placing one half on the ground. The dog watched, its tail giving a single, hesitant thump against the earth. After a moment, it crept forward and took the offering. Arthur looked at the dog, at its matted fur, and its ribs still visible beneath its skin. He looked at its intelligent eyes, full of a caution that had been learned the hard way. He thought of the junkyard around them, a place of rust and decay. "Rusty," Arthur said softly. The dog's ears twitched at the sound. "I think I'll call you Rusty." Inside. In that moment, something inside Arthur shifted. His own problems, the mountain of debt, the failed business, the broken family, were all still there, as massive and insurmountable as ever. But they were no longer the only thing in his world. Now, there was a new, immediate list of priorities. Find a clean bowl for water. Figure out how to get more food. Find a way to earn this dog's trust. For the first time in a very long time, Arthur Pendleton was thinking about the needs of another. He was no longer just a man trying to survive, he was a man with a dog to care for. It was a fragile, terrifying responsibility, but it was also an anchor, and it was enough to pull him out of the hopeless depths. The presence of another living soul in the RV changed its atmosphere entirely. The oppressive silence was now filled with the soft panting of a sleeping dog, the click of his nails on the linoleum floor, and the occasional happy thump of his tail against a cabinet. Rusty, as Arthur now called him, was a shadow at his heels. He followed Arthur during his morning work sorting scrap, lying patiently in a patch of sun, and he followed him back to the Winnebago in the evenings. The dog's fear was slowly receding, replaced by a quiet, unwavering devotion that Arthur found both humbling and terrifying. It was a trust he felt he had not earned. This new responsibility spurred Arthur into action. He could not live in filth, and he would not ask his new companion to either. He decided to wage war on the years of grime and neglect inside the RV. Armed with a bucket of soapy water from an outdoor spigot and a set of old rags, he started the monumental task of cleaning. He scrubbed away layers of dust and mildew, his arms aching, sweat dripping from his brow. Rusty seemed to understand the mission, staying out of the way but watching intently from the doorway, his head cocked with curiosity. It was while tackling a stubborn, built-in bench near the back that the discovery happened. The space was cramped, filled with old newspapers from 1995, and the distinct, musty smell of decay. Arthur was pulling out the yellowed papers when Rusty, who had been sniffing around the base of the bench, suddenly became fixated on a small, floor-level panel. He pushed his nose against it, whining softly, and began to scratch at the edge with a paw. "What is it, boy?" Arthur asked, pausing his work. "You smell a mouse in there?" Rusty looked back at him, gave a short, sharp bark, and returned to scratching, more insistent this time. Intrigued, Arthur ran his hand along the bottom of the bench. His fingers found a small, recessed latch. He pulled. With a groan of protest, the panel swung open, revealing a dark, hidden storage compartment. The air that emerged was dry and smelled faintly of cedar and oil. Reaching inside, Arthur's hands closed around the cold, heavy shape of a metal box. He pulled it out into the light. It was an old toolbox, its green paint chipped and scarred with rust, but it was solid. He lifted the latches, which opened with a loud click, and raised the lid. Inside, nestled in faded red felt, lay a small collection of hand tools. They were not for mechanics, but for a woodworker. There was a set of carving knives with smooth wooden handles, a small block plane, a handful of chisels, and a sharpening stone. They were old, but the steel was high quality, protected from the damp by a thin layer of oil. A wave of profound and painful nostalgia washed over Arthur. For a moment, he was not in a derelict RV, but back in his own workshop, the air thick with the scent of sawdust, his hands steady and sure. The memory was so sharp, so real, that his right hand began to tremble. A familiar, hated tremor that always came when the ghosts of his past drew too close. He quickly shut the lid, his breath catching in his throat. He could not do this. The tools represented a life that was gone, a skill that had been corrupted by the stress of deadlines and payrolls, and finally broken by the trauma he carried inside him. He pushed the box aside, but Rusty nudged it with his nose, looking up at Arthur with questioning eyes. The dog's simple, insistent presence was a silent challenge. Arthur looked at his own shaking hand, then back at the toolbox. With a deep, shuddering breath, he opened it again. He picked up the smallest carving knife. The handle felt like a piece of him he thought he had lost forever. Later that day, he found a small, solid block of discarded pine in the scrap wood pile. He sat on the steps of the RV, the afternoon sun warming his back. Rusty lay at his feet, head on his paws, watching. Arthur placed the wood in his left hand and the knife in his right. The tremor was still there, a frustrating vibration that made the blade skitter uselessly across the surface of the wood. Failure coiled in his stomach. He was about to throw the wood into the mud when he felt a wet nose press against his trembling hand. He looked down. Rusty was looking up at him, not with pity, but with simple, uncomplicated faith. Arthur took another breath. He closed his eyes, forcing away the memories of the workshop, the unpaid bills, the angry clients. He focused only on the feel of the wood, the weight of the knife. He remembered his father, the man who had first taught him how to carve, the quiet joy of making something beautiful from a simple piece of wood. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to work. The tremor did not vanish, but as he focused, as his muscle memory began to awaken, it lessened. The world around him faded away. There was only the scrape of the blade, the curl of the wood shaving, and the emerging shape in his hands. An hour later, he was done. He held in his palm a small, simple carving of a sitting dog, its head tilted, its ears alert. It was rough, imperfect, but it was whole. It was the first thing he had created in over 2 years. He held it out to Rusty, who sniffed it curiously before licking Arthur's hand. It was at that moment that Gus limped over, a thermos of coffee in his hand. He stopped, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. The cleaner RV, the open toolbox, and the small, wooden figure in Arthur's hand. "Well, I'll be," Gus said, his voice softer than usual. He reached for the carving, and Arthur handed it to him. Gus turned it over in his calloused fingers, a look of genuine admiration on his face. "You've got a gift, son. There's life in this little thing." Arthur just shrugged, a flush of pride and embarrassment warming his neck. "You know," Gus said, handing the carving back, "the flea market down by the bridge is open this weekend. A fella could sell a few things like this, not to get rich, just to make a little something that's all his." He looked Arthur straight in the eye, and Arthur understood. This was more than just a suggestion to make money. It was a chance to reclaim a piece of himself. Gus nodded, left the thermos on the steps, and walked away. Arthur looked down at the wooden dog in his hand, then at the real one, resting at his feet. A flicker of warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. It was hope. Gus's suggestion settled in Arthur's mind and refused to leave. The idea of putting his work, a fragile piece of his recovering soul, on display for strangers to judge, was terrifying. For 2 days, he avoided the toolbox, busying himself with the demanding physical labor of sorting scrap metal, hoping the exhaustion would silence the nagging thought. But every time he returned to the RV, he would see the little wooden dog sitting on the small counter, a silent testament to a skill he thought he had buried. And beside it, Rusty would be waiting, his amber eyes filled with a simple, trusting faith that Arthur felt compelled to honor. On the 3rd day, he gave in. He spent the entire day sitting on the steps of the Winnebago, a block of wood in one hand, a carving knife in the other. Rusty lay beside him, a warm and solid presence. The tremor in Arthur's hand was still there, a constant, unwelcome guest. But he was learning to work with it, to breathe through it, to find moments of stillness where the blade would obey his will. He carved another dog, then a cat curled in a sleeping ball, its form smooth and satisfying to the touch. He followed that with a series of small birds, each one with its head cocked in a different, inquisitive pose. He lost all track of time, the rhythmic scraping of the knife, a form of meditation. For the first time in years, he was not fighting his past or dreading his future. He was simply present, creating. By Friday evening, he had a small collection of 12 wooden figures. They were not perfect. He could see the flaws, the small hesitations where his hand had trembled, but as Gus had said, they had life in them. Saturday morning arrived with a cool, crisp dawn. Arthur awoke with a knot of anxiety in his stomach. He nearly convinced himself not to go. It was a foolish idea. People would laugh. He was a failure, and this would only prove it once more. As he was about to retreat, Gus appeared at the RV door, holding a folded card table and a clean, worn wool blanket. "Market opens in an hour," Gus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Don't want to be late. It's some bore." And so, Arthur found himself walking the half-mile to the bridge, a cardboard box of his carvings in his arms, the old table tucked under the other. Rusty trotted happily beside him, oblivious to the storm of self-doubt raging inside his human. The flea market was a vibrant, chaotic explosion of life. Music played from a crackling speaker. The air smelled of grilled sausages and canvas tents, and a river of people flowed between rows of vendors, selling everything from antique furniture to handmade jewelry. Arthur felt profoundly out of place. He found an empty spot at the end of a row, near the stone abutment of the bridge. He unfolded the table, spread the blanket over it, and arranged his small wooden animals with trembling hands. He sat down on an overturned bucket, with Rusty lying quietly at his feet, and he waited. People streamed past. They glanced at his table, their eyes sliding over his humble display without stopping. A group of teenagers laughed as they walked by, and Arthur was certain they were laughing at him. The knot in his stomach tightened. This was a mistake. A terrible, humiliating mistake. He began to mentally pack up his things, to plan his retreat back to the anonymous safety of the junkyard. Just as he was about to stand, an elderly woman stopped in front of his table. She had soft, white hair and eyes crinkled at the corners by a lifetime of smiles. She moved slowly, leaning on a cane, and she looked at his carvings not with a passing glance, but with genuine interest. "Oh my," she said, her voice gentle. She pointed a frail, delicate finger at one of the small birds. "Did you make these yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," Arthur managed to say, his voice tight. "They are lovely," she said. "They have such character." She picked up the carving of the sleeping cat, cradling it in her palm. "This looks just like my Mittens did when she was a kitten. She passed away in the spring of 2014. She smiled, a sad but fond expression. "How much for this one?" Arthur was so stunned he could not speak for a moment. He had not even thought about prices. $5? He said, the words coming out as a question. "That's a bargain," the woman said, opening her handbag. She handed him a crisp $5 bill. "Thank you. You've made my day." She placed the carving carefully in her bag and walked away. Arthur stared at the bill in his hand. It was more than just money. It was validation. It was proof that something he had made, something that had come from his own hands and his own heart, had value to someone else. He looked down at Rusty, who thumped his tail against the pavement. The first sale seemed to break a spell. An hour later, a father bought one of the dogs for his young son. Then a woman bought 2 of the birds. It was not a flood of business, just a slow, steady trickle. By the end of the day, when the crowds began to thin and the other vendors started to pack up, Arthur had sold 7 of his 12 carvings. He had $35 crumpled in his pocket. The walk back to the junkyard felt different. His shoulders were a little straighter, his step a little lighter. The weight of failure had not vanished, but it felt less crushing. Before returning to the yard, he made 2 stops. The first was a small pet supply store. He walked out with a big bag of high-quality, nutritious dog food, the kind he could never have afforded before. The second stop was the hardware store. He spent a long time looking at the different cans of wood stain and varnish before choosing a small can of warm oak stain and a packet of fine grit sandpaper. Back at the RV, he tore open the bag of dog food and filled a clean bowl for Rusty, who ate with an enthusiasm that made Arthur smile. Then Arthur sat on the steps, the new can of stain in his hands. He looked at the peeling, faded exterior of the Winnebago. He ran his hand over the rough, weathered wood of the door frame. It was a wreck. It was a heap of junk, but for the first time he saw not just what it was, but what it could be. It was a project. He had the tools. He had the skill. And now, thanks to a few scraps of wood and the kindness of strangers, he had a start. The week after the flea market was one of the most peaceful Arthur had known in years. A quiet routine settled over his corner of the junkyard. Mornings were for labor, working alongside Gus, the physical exertion a welcome balm. Afternoons were for creation. He would sit on the steps of the RV, a piece of wood in his hands, with Rusty dozing in the sun nearby. The small pile of money he had earned was a constant source of quiet pride. He had sanded and stained the RV's old wooden door, and the warm oak finish was a small island of beauty in a sea of decay. For the first time, he was not just surviving, he was building. He was in the middle of sanding the frame of a dinette window, the rhythmic scrape of paper on wood, a soothing sound, when Rusty suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears swiveled toward the main gate, and a low, almost silent rumble started deep in his chest. A moment later, Arthur heard the crunch of tires on gravel. It was not Gus's old truck. This was the sound of a modern car, its engine a smooth, quiet hum that seemed alien in this world of groaning metal. Arthur stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. A sleek, late-model sedan, clean and gray, had parked near the office. Two figures got out. Even from a distance, Arthur's heart seized in his chest. He would know them anywhere. His son, Michael, was 28, with the same tall frame as Arthur, but where Arthur was worn down, Michael was rigid, with a tension that seemed permanently coiled in his shoulders. He was dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, looking like he had just come from an office. His face, which used to be quick to smile, was now a tight mask of grim determination. His daughter, Clara, was 24. She had her mother's grace, but Arthur's kind, expressive eyes. She stood beside her brother, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, a shield against the world. She looked smaller and more fragile than he remembered. They walked toward him, their steps hesitant on the uneven ground, their faces a mixture of disbelief and horror as they took in the mountains of scrap, the mud, and the dilapidated RV that was their father's home. "Dad?" Clara's voice was a whisper, carried on the breeze. "Michael, Clara," Arthur said, his own voice thick. "What are you doing here?" "We've been looking for you for weeks," Michael said, his voice sharp, accusatory. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the scene with disgust. "We've been calling, leaving messages. We thought, we didn't know. And we find you here? In a junkyard?" "I'm working here," Arthur said, gesturing vaguely at the piles of scrap. "Gus, the owner, he's been good to me." "Good to you?" Michael's voice rose, disbelief turning to anger. He pointed at the RV. "By letting you live in this thing? This piece of junk? Is this what it's come to?" "It's a roof over my head, Michael. It's a start," Arthur tried to explain, his words feeling weak and hollow. "A start to what?" Michael shot back, his hands clenched into fists. "Another project? Another brilliant idea to pour everything into until it all falls apart again? We've seen this before, Dad. We lived through it. The workshop was supposed to be a start, and look how that ended. Essay. When Phi Dory." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. He flinched, the memory of his failed business, of the shame and the loss, rising like bile in his throat. "This is different," he said, his voice barely audible. "How is it different?" Michael demanded. "You're hiding in a pile of garbage, selling little wooden toys at a flea market. We heard about it from Mrs. Gable. Is that the big plan? Is that how you're going to fix everything?" Clara put a hand on her brother's arm. "Michael, stop." But Michael shook her off. The dam of his long-held anger had broken. "No, I won't stop. He needs to hear this. We lost everything because of his last project. The house. Mom, do you have any idea what that was like for us?" Arthur had no answer. He could only stand there, stripped bare by his son's righteous anger, the weight of his failure crushing him. He was a fool, a pathetic old man living in a tin can. They were right. It was then that Rusty, who had been lying silently by the steps, rose to his feet. He did not bark. He did not growl. With a calm, deliberate grace, he walked forward and placed himself directly in front of Arthur, creating a living barrier between him and his children. He sat down, his back almost touching Arthur's legs. He looked up at Michael, then at Clara, and let out a soft, low whine, a sound that was not a threat, but a plea. His amber eyes were filled with a profound, sorrowful confusion, as if to ask why they would speak with such cruelty to the man who was the center of his world. The unexpected act of loyalty silenced the argument. Michael stared at the dog, his anger momentarily short-circuited by confusion, but it was Clara who was truly shaken. She looked from the dog's pleading eyes to her father's devastated face, She saw the unwavering devotion in the animal's posture, a silent declaration of love and protection. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced her own anger. She saw not just a failed businessman, but a lonely man who had a loyal friend. She saw a situation that was perhaps more complicated than she had allowed herself to believe. "This is ridiculous," Michael finally spat, though his voice had lost its conviction. "We're leaving." He turned on his heel and stalked back toward the car without another word. Clara lingered for a moment, her eyes locked with her father's sate. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She turned and followed her brother, leaving Arthur alone in the sudden, deafening silence. Arthur slumped down onto the steps, his body feeling heavy and useless. All the progress, all the fragile hope of the past week had been shattered. He was right back where he started. He felt a wet nose push into his hand, and then a heavy head rested on his knee. He looked down into Rusty's worried eyes and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in his thick fur. Later that evening, in her quiet apartment across town, Clara stared at her phone. Her brother's angry words still echoed in her ears, but it was the image of the dog that she could not shake. That quiet, dignified act of protection. She found the phone number for Gus's auto salvage online. Her finger hovered over the call button. With a deep breath, she pressed it. "Gus's," a gruff voice answered. "Hello," Clara said, her own voice small and hesitant. "My name is Clara Pendleton. I was hoping you could tell me about my father." The day after his children's visit, a heavy blanket of despair settled over Arthur. The small joys he had found in his carving, in the quiet companionship of Rusty, in the honest labor of his hands, all seemed to evaporate under the harsh glare of Michael's words. Another project, another failure. The phrase echoed in his mind, a cruel and constant refrain. He went about his work sorting metal, but his movements were mechanical, his spirit absent. The tremor in his hand had returned with a vengeance, making even the simple act of holding a coffee cup a challenge. He did not touch the carving tools. Rusty stayed closer than ever, sensing the deep shift in his master's mood. The dog rested his head on Arthur's knee whenever he sat down, his amber eyes filled with a silent, steadying comfort. It was a comfort Arthur felt he did not deserve. That evening, Gus found him sitting on the steps of the RV, staring blankly at the mountains of scrap as the sun went down, casting long, distorted shadows. Gus didn't say anything at first. He just handed Arthur a steaming mug of coffee and sat down beside him on the steps. "Your daughter called me last night," Gus said finally, his voice a low rumble. "She's worried about you." Arthur took a sip of the hot, bitter coffee, but said nothing. "A son's anger can be a sharp thing," Gus continued, looking out at the yard, "but it's often just a shield for his fear. Fear of seeing someone he loves get hurt again." "He was right," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. "I failed them. I failed everyone." "You hit a rough patch," Gus corrected him. "That ain't the same as being a failure. You served your country. You came home and built a business from nothing. That takes guts. The fact that it didn't work out doesn't erase the man you are." He took a long drink from his own mug. "You know, there are things you're owed, things you earned a long time ago that you never collected." Arthur looked at him, confused. "Your VA benefits," Gus said plainly. "You ever file a claim for disability? For the things you carry around from your time over there?" Arthur gave a short, bitter laugh. "I tried. Years ago, right after the business went under. I filled out a mountain of paperwork, sent it in, and heard nothing. Not a word. The system is a black hole, Gus. It's designed to make you give up." "Maybe," Gus said, finishing his coffee and setting the mug down with a firm click. "Or maybe you just didn't have the right map." He stood up, his joints creaking. "Get your jacket. We're going somewhere." 20 minutes later, Gus's old truck pulled up in front of a modest, single-story brick building. A simple sign out front read, "Veterans of Foreign Wars, Post 76. An American flag flew from a tall pole, illuminated by a spotlight against the twilight sky. Arthur felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He hadn't set foot in a place like this in over a decade. "Rusty will be fine in the truck for a bit," Gus said, seeing Arthur's hesitation. Inside, the building was clean, well lit, and smelled of brewing coffee and old paper. A few older men sat at tables, talking in low voices. It was a place of quiet, unassuming camaraderie. Gus led him to a small office at the back. Seated behind a large metal desk was a man in his late 60s, wearing a simple polo shirt and reading glasses. He had a calm, competent air about him, his desk organized with a neatness that spoke of military precision. "Arthur, this is Mr. Henderson," Gus said. "He's our post's service officer. He knows how to navigate the maze better than anyone." Mr. Henderson stood up and offered Arthur a firm handshake. His grip was strong, his eyes kind but direct. "Have a seat, Arthur. Gus tells me you've been having a bit of trouble with the VA." For the next hour, Arthur sat as Mr. Henderson asked him a series of precise questions. What was his service number? When did he serve? What was his last known address when he filed the claim? There was no pity in his voice, only a professional focus that Arthur found strangely calming. He typed the information into an old but functional desktop computer. The clicking of the keys, a steady, methodical rhythm. After several minutes of searching, Mr. Henderson stopped typing. He peered at the screen over the top of his glasses. "Well, here's the problem," he said. "Your claim was filed in the year 2018. It was never denied. It was stalled. They sent a request for a follow-up medical statement to your old address, but the letter was returned as undeliverable. Without that form, the claim just sat in limbo." Arthur stared at him, speechless. All these years he had assumed he was rejected, ignored. The truth was, he had simply been lost in the shuffle. "This is what we're going to do," Mr. Henderson continued, his voice all business. He turned to a printer, which whirred to life. "I'm printing out the form you need, and a few others to update your contact information. We're going to get you an appointment at the VA clinic for a new evaluation. I'll make the call myself tomorrow morning. It's not going to be fast, mind you, but it's not a black hole. You just need to follow the steps." He handed Arthur a thin stack of papers. On the top page, he had neatly written a list of instructions. For the first time, Arthur saw not an insurmountable mountain of bureaucracy, but a clear, manageable path. The drive back to the junkyard was quiet. Arthur held the papers in his lap, the crisp edges of the forms feeling solid and real beneath his fingertips. When they arrived, he opened the truck door and Rusty bounded out, greeting him with a joyous welcome as if he had been gone for days. Later that night, Arthur sat at the small dinette table in the RV, a single lamp casting a pool of warm light. He had the papers spread out before him. It was still a daunting process, but it was no longer his burden alone. He had an ally in Mr. Henderson. He had a friend in Gus. He had a community he had forgotten existed, and he had a loyal dog resting at his feet. The hope he felt now was different from the fragile pride he'd felt at the market. This was something stronger, something more grounded. It was the hope that he was not forgotten after all. The weeks that followed the visit to the VFW post settled into a new kind of rhythm, one defined by patient, hopeful waiting. Arthur had gone to his medical evaluation at the VA clinic, a sterile, impersonal experience that he endured with a quiet resolve he had not possessed before. With Mr. Henderson's guidance, he had filled out every form, checked every box, and mailed the thick packet of documents. Now, all that was left to do was wait. Life in the junkyard continued. He worked his hours for Gus, his body growing stronger and leaner from the labor. In the afternoons, he carved, his hands now steady and confident. His small collection of wooden animals grew, each one more detailed and lifelike than the last. He didn't take them to the flea market again. Instead, he was saving them, though he wasn't sure for what. Rusty flourished. The high-quality food and the sense of security had worked wonders. His gray and white coat was now thick and glossy, the gauntness in his frame replaced by healthy muscle. He was a constant, joyful presence, his trust in Arthur absolute. Every day, around noon, the mail carrier's small truck would make its way down the long gravel road to the junkyard office. And every day, Arthur would feel a familiar knot of hope and dread tighten in his stomach. He never asked Gus about the mail, but Gus always knew what he was waiting for. Each day, the old man would just shake his head slightly as he walked past the RV, and Arthur would go back to his work, the waiting stretched out for another 24 hours. Then, one sunny Tuesday afternoon, it happened. Gus walked toward the RV, not with a shake of the head, but with a thick, official-looking envelope in his hand. He held it out to Arthur without a word. The return address was from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Arthur's heart began to pound against his ribs. He took the envelope, his hands trembling for the first time in weeks. He thanked Gus, his voice a dry whisper. He did not open it right away. He walked into the RV and sat down at the dinette table, the letter feeling heavy and significant in his hands. Rusty, sensing the sudden tension, came over and rested his heavy head on Arthur's knee, whining softly. "It's okay, boy," Arthur said, stroking the dog's head. "Whatever it says, we're okay." With a deep breath, he tore open the envelope. His eyes scanned the dense bureaucratic language of the letter, the official terms and codes a confusing jumble. He had to read the first paragraph 3 times before the words finally broke through his anxiety and registered in his brain. "Your claim for service-connected disability has been approved. A disability rating of 70% has been assigned. A retroactive payment for benefits dating from your original file date of October 2018 will be issued." He kept reading until he found the number, a figure so large it seemed impossible, a number with a comma in it. He stared at it, his vision blurring. All the years of struggle, of feeling forgotten and discarded, of believing his sacrifices meant nothing, coalesced into a single, overwhelming wave of emotion. It was not just joy. It was a profound, earth-shaking relief, so powerful it felt like grief. A sob escaped his throat, a raw, ragged sound he could not control. He dropped his head into his hands and wept, tears of vindication and sorrow streaming through his fingers. Rusty pushed closer, licking his hand, a silent, steadfast witness to the moment a man's life changed. After the storm of emotion passed, a deep sense of calm settled over Arthur. He wiped his face, his mind surprisingly clear. He knew exactly what he had to do. He folded the letter, tucked it carefully into his pocket, and walked over to Gus's office. Gus was sitting at his desk, pretending to read a parts catalog. He looked up as Arthur entered, his expression neutral, but his sharp eyes saw everything. Arthur simply placed the letter on the desk. Gus read it slowly, then looked up and gave a single, slow nod. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a quiet satisfaction, like a man who knew the sun would rise and was simply glad to see it. "Well then," Gus said, "looks like you've got some decisions to make." "Just one for now," Arthur replied, his voice steady. "Can I borrow a notepad and a pen? I need to make a plan, a proper one this time." For the next hour, the two veterans sat at the cluttered desk, a fresh pot of coffee between them. This was not the impulsive, dream-driven planning that had characterized Arthur's first business. This was a sober, methodical accounting. Gus, with his decades of practical experience, acted as a grounding force. "First things first," Gus said, tapping the notepad. "Engine. You can't build a house on a rotten foundation. Find a good, honest mechanic. Not the cheapest one. The best one." Arthur wrote it down. "Engine repair. Then, tires. All 6 of them, plus a spare. Don't cut corners there. Tires," Arthur wrote. They went on like that, creating a blueprint for the RV's rebirth. Plumbing, electrical systems, propane tanks, water heater. Each item was a line on the page, a piece of a puzzle that now seemed solvable. Arthur listened to Gus's advice, asked questions, and for the first time felt like the master of his own finances, not their victim. He was determined, with every fiber of his being, not to repeat the mistakes of his past. He walked back to the RV that evening, the completed budget clutched in his hand. The numbers on the page were not a source of anxiety, but a source of power. They were a map. He stepped inside and looked around at the stained carpets, the cracked vinyl, the water-marked ceiling. It was still a wreck. But he no longer saw only the decay, he saw the potential. He saw the strong bones beneath the ugly surface. The hope he felt was no longer a fragile flicker. It was a steady, burning flame. He had the resources, he had the plan, and he had the skill. He was not just going to fix his home, he was going to build a future. With the budget carefully planned and the money secured in a new bank account, Arthur transformed from a man adrift into a man with a mission. His first call, on Gus's recommendation, was to a mechanic named Sal. Sal arrived the next day, his tow truck looking powerful enough to move mountains of scrap, let alone one old RV. He was a stocky man in his 50s, built like a fire hydrant, with hands that seemed permanently stained with the ghosts of past engines. He chewed on an unlit cigar, his expression a permanent mask of professional skepticism. He walked a slow circle around the Winnebago, kicking one of the flat tires and peering underneath with a practiced eye. "She's a dinosaur, pal," Sal grunted, his voice rough. "You'd be better off turning her into a planter." "I know what she is," Arthur said, his voice calm and steady. "And I know what she can be. I'm not asking for a miracle. I'm asking for your best work. I want the engine rebuilt, not patched. I want it reliable." He handed Sal the notepad with his budget. "This is what I can spend. I want it done right." Sal looked from the notepad to Arthur, his skeptical gaze softening slightly. He saw not a dreamer, but a serious man. "All right," he said, tucking the cigar into his shirt pocket. "It's your money. I'll get her back to my shop and see what we're dealing with." As Sal and his crew worked on the mechanical heart of the RV over the following weeks, Arthur focused on its soul. The project, he quickly realized, was bigger than just his own skills. The old wiring was a fire hazard, and the plumbing was a complete disaster. The old Arthur would have tried to tackle it all himself, cutting corners and getting overwhelmed. The new Arthur knew better. He learned from Gus that a retired electrician, a man named Dave, lived a few miles away. Arthur paid him a visit, his box of carving tools in the back of his truck. Dave's workshop was a cluttered space, his tools disorganized on a flimsy set of shelves. Arthur made his proposal. "I can see you're a man who respects good tools," he said. "They deserve a proper home. I will build you a custom, solid oak workbench with built-in storage for all your gear. In exchange, I need you to rewire my RV safely." Dave, a lanky man with a shock of white hair, looked at Arthur's hands, saw the calluses of a fellow craftsman, and agreed. A similar deal was struck with a plumber, who received a set of beautifully handcrafted cedar planter boxes for his wife's garden, in exchange for installing a new water heater and pipes. The Junkyard, once a place of solitude, became a small hub of activity. Men with different skills came and went, each contributing a piece to the puzzle. They were drawn in by Arthur's quiet determination and his obvious, breathtaking talent with wood. He was no longer just the lost soul living in the corner of the yard. He was the carpenter, the project manager, a man who paid his debts with skill and sweat. While the specialists worked, Arthur poured his own energy into the interior. With Rusty as his constant watchful companion, he tore out the stained, musty carpets. He replaced the rotten sections of the subfloor. He insulated the walls, then began the painstaking process of paneling them with thin, beautiful sheets of birch wood. He was not just repairing, he was recreating. Every cut was precise, every joint was perfect. He was building the workshop he had lost, only this time it was small, mobile, and it was his home. The day finally came when Sal called. "She's ready," was all he said. The following afternoon, the restored RV was towed back to its spot in the junkyard, gleaming with a new sense of pride. Its 6 new tires were black and solid. From the outside, it was still an old vehicle, but it no longer looked derelict. It looked cared for. Sal was there, along with Dave, the electrician, and Gus. There was a quiet, shared sense of anticipation in the air. "Go on," Sal said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Turn her over." Arthur's heart hammered in his chest. He opened the newly stained door, and Rusty hopped in ahead of him, taking his usual spot on the passenger seat. Arthur slid behind the wheel. The dashboard was clean. The gauges were new. He took a deep, steadying breath and turned the key. The starter motor groaned, a long, protesting sound. The engine sputtered, coughed once, and died. Arthur's stomach clenched. A flicker of the old, familiar dread washed over him. "Give it a moment," Sal called from outside. "Let the fuel circulate. It's note in hand. It's slight." Arthur waited a full minute that felt like an eternity. He looked at Rusty, who looked back at him with unwavering confidence. He tried again. He turned the key. This time, there was no hesitation. The engine caught with a deafening roar, a deep, powerful rumble that vibrated through the entire frame of the vehicle. It was not the sound of a dying machine. It was the sound of a powerful heart beating strong and steady. It was the sound of life. Outside, Sal grunted with satisfaction. Gus allowed himself a rare, wide smile. But inside, Arthur closed his eyes, his hands resting on the vibrating steering wheel. The roar of the engine was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of his own revival. It was the sound of a future he could now drive towards. He was no longer a man stranded in a graveyard of broken things. He was a man in a home, and that home was finally ready to move. With the mechanical heart of the RV now beating strong, Arthur turned his full, undivided attention to finishing the interior. The roar of the engine had been a declaration of life, but the soul of the home was in the wood. He worked with a focused, joyful intensity he had not felt since he was a young man first discovering his love for the craft. The birchwood paneling was complete, glowing with a soft, warm light under several coats of varnish. He had built a small, clever kitchenette, a comfortable sleeping bunk, and a compact dinette table that folded away to save space. Every cabinet door fit perfectly. Every joint was a testament to his rediscovered skill. The space was no longer a derelict shell. It was a testament to resilience, a small, perfect jewel box, carved from the ruins of his life. But two projects remained, and these were the most important of all. He had saved the best pieces of wood for them. For Clara, he worked on a small, elegant baby cradle. He fashioned it from a single beautiful piece of cherry wood he had found in Gus's scrap pile. Its grain, a swirling river of reds and browns. He sanded it until it was as smooth as polished stone, and carved small, delicate songbirds along the rockers. It was a piece filled with love and hope, a promise for the new life his daughter was bringing into the world. For Michael, the gift was more complicated. He took a block of walnut and, with the finest of his carving knives, began to create a perfect, miniature replica of the first toolbox his own father had given him as a boy. Every tiny latch, every miniature hinge was carved with painstaking precision. Inside, he crafted tiny wooden tools, a hammer, a saw, a screwdriver. It was not just a gift, it was an apology. It was an acknowledgement of the past, a memory of a time before the business, before the pressure and the failure, when working with wood was simply a bond between a father and his son. When the last coat of oil had soaked into the walnut and the cradle was assembled, he knew it was time. His hand was steady as he picked up his phone. He dialed Clara's number, his heart beating a calm, even rhythm. "Hello?" Her voice was hesitant, cautious. "Clara, it's Dad," he said, his own voice clear and strong. "I was hoping you and Michael might come for a visit. I have something I want to show you. Something I want to give you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Arthur could hear the unspoken questions, the fear of another confrontation. "We'll be there," she said finally, her voice soft. "Tomorrow afternoon." The next day, the same sleek gray sedan pulled up to the junkyard gate. Arthur was waiting for them, standing beside the RV. He was not the broken man they had seen weeks ago. He was clean-shaven, wearing a new flannel shirt, and he stood with a quiet, solid dignity. Rusty sat faithfully at his side, his tail giving a few slow, welcoming thumps against the ground. Michael and Clara got out of the car, their expressions guarded, but as they got closer, their steps slowed. They were not looking at their father, but at the vehicle behind him. The old, peeling Winnebago was gone. In its place stood a clean, restored motorhome. Its body had been buffed and polished, its chrome gleamed in the afternoon sun, and its new tires were black and solid. The transformation was so complete, it was startling. "Dad?" Clara breathed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Come inside," Arthur said simply, opening the newly stained door. They hesitated for a moment, then stepped up into the RV. And they stopped, speechless. The interior was even more shocking than the exterior. The musty, decaying shell had been reborn. The warm, glowing birchwood walls, the polished floor, the immaculate kitchenette, the soft cushions on the dinette benches. It was not an RV anymore. It was a tiny, perfect cabin, a masterpiece of craftsmanship and care. The air smelled of fresh wood and varnish, not of mold and despair. For a long moment, no one spoke. Michael ran his hand along the edge of a perfectly fitted cabinet door, his expression unreadable. Clara just stood in the middle of the small space, turning in a slow circle, taking it all in. "It's beautiful," she finally whispered. Arthur's heart swelled. He then moved to the back of the RV. He first lifted the baby cradle, its cherry wood glowing in the light from the window, and presented it to Clara. Tears welled in her eyes instantly as she ran her hand over the smooth, carved birds. She looked at her father, her expression a mixture of awe and dawning understanding. "Dad, I don't know what to say." Next, Arthur picked up the small walnut toolbox and handed it to Michael. His son took it, his movements stiff. He stared at it, turning it over in his hands. He opened the tiny latches and saw the miniature tools inside. His rigid composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. "I had one just like this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You made it for me, for my 8th birthday." "I remember," Arthur said softly. Michael looked up, his eyes meeting his father's. "Mpe." The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, painful regret. "Dad, I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "I was so wrong. I saw this place, this RV, and all I could see was the workshop. All I could see was the risk, the failure. I didn't see you. I didn't see that you were building yourself back up." "I called Gus," Clara added, her own tears now flowing freely. "After we left that day, he told me everything, about how you've been working, about the carvings, about Rusty." She knelt down and stroked the dog's head, and Rusty leaned into her touch. "I was just so scared. I didn't want to see you get hurt again." Arthur looked at his children, at their tear-stained faces, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The anger and the hurt had finally given way to love. "I hurt you both," Arthur said, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "The business. I let it consume me. I lost sight of what was important. This," he gestured around the small, beautiful space, "this isn't a business. It's a home. And these," he looked at the gifts in their hands, "these were made with love, not with pressure. That's the difference." He stepped forward and pulled them both into an embrace. For the first time in years, the three of them stood together, not as broken pieces of a family, but as a whole. The reconciliation was quiet, profound, and complete, unfolding in the heart of the home that had been built from the wreckage of their past. The air around Gus's auto salvage and scrap had a different feel that morning. It was crisp and cool, carrying the promise of a bright autumn day. The usual sounds of grinding metal and distant traffic were softened by a quiet sense of anticipation. The Winnebago, no longer a forgotten relic, stood gleaming in the pale sunlight, its freshly waxed exterior reflecting the sky. Its tires were fully inflated, its engine hummed with a quiet power, and inside it was a home, cozy and inviting. Arthur stood beside it, his heart full, watching Gus attach a small, intricately carved wooden bird to the RV's rearview mirror. It was a gift from Arthur, a silent thank you to the man who had given him a second chance. "She's a beauty, Arthur," Gus said, his gruff voice softened by emotion. He clapped Arthur on the shoulder. "You built more than just a home here, son. You built yourself back up." Arthur nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Soon a familiar gray sedan pulled up, carrying Michael and Clara. They stepped out, their faces alight with a mixture of excitement and a touch of melancholy. This was a goodbye, but also a beginning. Clara carried a small bag, presumably with supplies for the road. Michael, for his part, looked less burdened than Arthur had seen him in years, a genuine smile playing on his lips. Rusty, sensing the excitement, trotted back and forth between Arthur and the car, his tail wagging with joyful anticipation. He was ready for an adventure. "Ready, Dad?" Michael asked, a lightness in his voice Arthur hadn't heard in ages. Arthur took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." They began to load their few belongings into the RV. Rusty, with a happy bark, jumped into his usual spot on the passenger seat, settling in immediately, as if he had always belonged there. Clara carefully placed the cherry wood cradle in the back, securing it so it wouldn't shift during the journey. Michael put his miniature toolbox on a small shelf near the dinette, a symbol of their renewed connection. Before they departed, Arthur walked over to Gus, who stood by his office door, observing the scene with a quiet satisfaction. Arthur extended his hand. "Thank you, Gus," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "For everything, for the job, for the RV, for believing in me when no one else did. You gave me a home when I had nothing." Gus gripped his hand firmly, his eyes twinkling. "You earned it, Arthur, every bit of it. You just needed a push." He paused, then added, "Don't be a stranger, you hear? The gate's always open." Arthur nodded, a smile touching his lips. He turned and walked back to the RV, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and peace. He was not alone anymore. He climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was new, the dashboard gleaming. He looked at Rusty beside him, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He looked in the rearview mirror, meeting Michael and Clara's eyes. They smiled back, full of hope. Arthur put his hand on the gear shift. He took another deep, cleansing breath, pushing away the last tendrils of doubt and fear. The road ahead was uncertain, as all roads are. But this time, he was ready. He had a plan. He had his skills. He had his family. And he had Rusty, his most loyal companion. He turned the key. The engine roared to life, a powerful, steady hum that filled the cabin. He put the RV in gear. With a gentle lurch, the Winnebago began to roll forward. Slowly, deliberately, it made its way down the gravel path, leaving behind the mountains of scrap and the echoes of a broken past. Gus stood by the gate, a solitary figure, watching them go, a small, knowing smile on his face. Arthur gave a final wave and then turned his attention to the open road. The RV reached the main gate and turned right, heading towards the highway that would take them out of Portland, out of Oregon, and towards whatever new adventures awaited them. The sun, now higher in the sky, broke through the clouds, bathing the landscape in a golden light. Arthur glanced at Rusty, who looked up at him, then back at the road, his ears perked, a quiet excitement in his stance. He was ready. Michael leaned forward from the back. "So, Dad," he said, his voice bright, "where are we going first?" Arthur smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that reached his eyes. "Anywhere we want, son. Anywhere we want." The Winnebago, once a symbol of his despair, was now a vessel of hope, carrying a healed family, a loyal dog, and a future full of possibilities, down a road that stretched endlessly before them. The journey had truly begun.